It was a Tuesday morning in Bracketville, Texas, and the dust had not yet settled over the courthouse steps when a woman stood alone in the summer heat, watching strangers prepare to take everything she had left. No lawyer beside her, no family to hold her hand, just a widow in a cotton dress, clutching a handkerchief, staring at the door that was about to close on 40 years of her life. The men gathering on those steps did not know her name. They knew only the number, the debt, the default, the date. But somewhere across that same town, a man had heard what was about to happen, and he was already moving. Her name was May Hopper, and she had lived in the same white clapboard house on the edge of Kinney County for 39 years. She had moved there as a young bride in 1920, the same year her husband Calvin planted the first row of pecan trees along the southern fence line. Trees, he said, would outlast them both. He was right about that, though not in the way either of them had imagined. Calvin Hopper died in the spring of 1957, quietly, the way good men sometimes do, in the early hours before the Texas sun had fully committed to rising. He left May with the land, the house, a used Ford pickup, and a debt she had not known existed until the letters began arriving. Calvin had borrowed against the property in 1955, a loan meant to cover the cost of a failed cotton harvest and a medical bill that had grown faster than he could manage. He had kept the details close to his chest the way men of his generation often did, believing it was his burden to carry and his alone. By the time May understood the full weight of what remained, the interest had compounded, the bank had changed hands twice, and a new regional lender out of San Antonio had decided that patience was no longer a profitable policy. May had tried. That much needs to be said plainly, and without qualification, she had tried in every way a 61-year-old woman in 1959 could try. She had sold the Ford. She had rented out the small back room to a schoolteacher for 14 months. She had applied for a modest agricultural assistance loan through the county office and been told, with practiced bureaucratic detachment, that the timeline did not favour her case. She had written 3 letters to the lending institution, each one more careful and more desperate than the last, and received in return 2 form responses and 1 silence. What made the injustice land so heavily was not just the money, it was what the house meant. Her daughter had been born in the front bedroom. Her son had learned to walk on that porch. Calvin had built the kitchen cabinets by hand over 2 rainy weekends in 1931, and his fingerprints, metaphorically, indelibly, were still in the grain of that wood. The pecan trees were bearing fruit again for the first time in years, and on a Tuesday morning in August, all of it was scheduled to be transferred to whoever arrived with the highest bid and the least sentiment. The auction had been announced in the local paper. It drew the kind of quiet, opportunistic attention that distressed property sales always attract in small Texas towns. Investors from San Antonio, a land speculator from Del Rio, a couple of men who had been watching the parcel for years. May stood among them, not as a bidder, but as a remnant. A woman whose presence at her own dispossession was technically optional, but emotionally unavoidable. She had nowhere else to go, so she came to watch. And she held her handkerchief, and she did not cry, because she had made a decision somewhere in the preceding sleepless nights that she would not give the proceedings that satisfaction. What she did not know, could not have known, was that her situation had travelled beyond the courthouse steps. A word spoken at a diner, a remark overheard at a hardware store, a story passed from one mouth to another in the unhurried way that small-town grief moves through a community. And it had reached someone who was not from Bracketville, not from Kinney County, but who happened to be in the area, for reasons that were, at the time, considerably more cinematic than anything unfolding at that courthouse. He had come to Bracketville for the picture. That was the simple factual answer to why a man of his particular stature was spending the summer of 1959 in a town of fewer than 2,000 people in the southwestern edge of Texas. The production had set up its base of operations near the old Alamo Village set being constructed just outside of town, a sprawling, remarkably detailed recreation of the San Antonio mission that would serve as the centerpiece for a film he had spent years trying to bring to life. He was the kind of man whose presence in any room rearranged the geometry of it, not because he demanded attention, but because something in the way he moved, the way he occupied space, made it feel like the room had been waiting for him specifically. Those who encountered him during those weeks described him consistently, tall, unhurried, with a way of listening that made you feel like your words were being weighed rather than simply heard. He dressed practically, without performance, work shirts, worn boots, a hat that had seen actual weather. He ate at local establishments when the schedule allowed, and was known to stay at the table long after the meal was finished, talking with whoever happened to be nearby. He tipped generously. He remembered names. He asked questions about people's lives with the kind of genuine curiosity that does not perform itself. It was at one of those meals, at a small diner on the edge of town, that someone, accounts differ on whether it was a waitress, a local rancher, or one of the crew members who had been talking to residents, mentioned what was happening at the courthouse. Not as a news item delivered with urgency, but in the way that local hardships get mentioned in small-town conversation. Somewhere between the weather and the price of feed. A widow. The Hopper place. Tuesday morning. The bank had finally called it. He did not make a scene about it. He did not stand up from the table or make any dramatic declaration. He asked a few questions, quiet, specific questions about the amount owed, about whether there was any remaining legal avenue, about the woman's situation. He finished his coffee. He paid the bill. And then he made 2 phone calls, one to a local attorney and one to someone who handled certain financial matters on his behalf, and he asked that a number be confirmed. The number was confirmed, and Tuesday morning he got in his truck and drove to the courthouse. He arrived before the auction was scheduled to begin, which meant he arrived before most of the bidders had fully assembled. He parked without ceremony and walked to the courthouse steps with the same unhurried deliberateness that defined everything he did. May Hopper saw him before she understood who he was. She registered him the way you register any large, quietly confident man, as a presence before he becomes a person. Then someone near her said a name, low and almost involuntarily, and the name was John Wayne. He did not approach her immediately. He spoke first with the attorney he had contacted the previous evening, a brief exchange of documents and confirmed figures. Then he spoke with the representative of the lending institution, a man named Gerald Foss, who had travelled up from San Antonio and who was not, by most accounts, prepared for the particular nature of the conversation he was about to have. The exchange was short. Wayne had reviewed the outstanding debt, the principal, the accrued interest, the fees, and he had arranged, through his attorney, to satisfy the full amount on behalf of the property owner before the auction could proceed. Gerald Foss reportedly blinked several times. He asked for clarification. The attorney provided it in writing. The debt was being settled in full, immediately, in cash equivalent, which under the terms of the loan agreement meant the auction had no legal foundation on which to proceed. There was nothing improper about what Wayne had done. No legal manipulation, no theatrical obstruction. He had simply done the one thing that resolved everything. He had paid what was owed. The bidders, one by one, began to understand that there was nothing to bid on. The speculator from Del Rio lingered for a few minutes before accepting the situation and leaving. Gerald Foss made one phone call, spoke quietly, and then nodded with the resigned acknowledgement of a man whose function had been rendered obsolete. And then John Wayne turned and walked across the courthouse steps toward May Hopper, who had been standing through all of it without moving, without speaking, barely breathing, because she could not yet fully assemble what she was watching into something her mind was willing to accept as real. He was a large man, and he moved slowly enough that she had time to collect herself, or at least to attempt to. She did not entirely succeed. He stopped in front of her, and the crowd that had gathered, bidders, onlookers, courthouse staff, a deputy who had stepped outside to see what the commotion was, all of it went very quiet. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, simply and without drama, "The house is yours, ma'am." What happened in the seconds after those words is the kind of thing that witnesses remember differently, because memory is shaped by emotion, and there was considerable emotion present on those courthouse steps that morning. Some accounts say May Hopper nodded without speaking and kept her composure entirely. Others say she pressed the handkerchief to her eyes for just a moment before straightening. The deputy who was present later told a journalist that in 30 years of standing outside that courthouse, he had never seen anything like it. And he did not mean the intervention itself, which was remarkable enough, but the silence that followed it. The particular quality of stillness that settled over the square in the moments after Wayne spoke. The news travelled through Bracketville the way news travels in small towns. Rapidly, imprecisely, and with the embellishment that distance from the source tends to produce. By afternoon, the story had acquired several additional details that were likely not accurate, including a confrontation with Gerald Foss that apparently did not occur, and a speech Wayne allegedly gave about Texas and justice that no one who was actually present could corroborate. The truth, as it usually does, needed no embellishment. What was confirmed by multiple people who were there was this: John Wayne paid the full outstanding debt on May Hopper's property, an amount that, depending on the source, was somewhere between $4,000 and $6,000, which in 1959 represented a substantial sum by any measure, without any prior relationship with the woman, without any expectation of repayment, and without any apparent interest in being recognised for it. He had not contacted the local press. He had not brought a photographer. He had come in a work truck, handled the business quietly, said 5 words to the woman whose home he had just preserved, and then walked back to where he was needed. Several crew members from the film production later mentioned that Wayne returned to the Alamo Village set that afternoon and resumed work without discussing what had happened. A few of them had heard about it through the town's informal channels and asked him about it directly. His response, according to more than one account, was essentially to change the subject, not with irritation, but with the particular modesty of a man who does not consider decency to be a performance worth dwelling on. May Hopper lived in that house for 11 more years, until her death in 1970. The pecan trees Calvin had planted continued to produce. And in Bracketville, the story did not die with her. It passed instead into the informal archive of things that town knew about itself. Things that mattered, things that said something true about who could appear on your worst morning and decide, without obligation or audience, that it was simply the right thing to do. There is a version of this story that emphasizes the celebrity of it, the fact that the man who walked across those courthouse steps was one of the most recognizable figures in the world. A man whose face was on movie posters from Los Angeles to London, whose name carried the particular weight of cultural mythology that very few human beings ever accumulate in a single lifetime. That version of the story is not untrue, but it is, in some essential way, beside the point. Because what John Wayne did on that Tuesday morning in Bracketville was not something he did as John Wayne the actor or John Wayne the icon. He did it as a man who had heard that something wrong was happening close enough to where he stood that he could do something about it. The scale of his fame is irrelevant to the moral architecture of the act, and yet his fame is also, paradoxically, what has allowed the act to survive the decades and reach us now, which means we owe the legend at least some portion of our gratitude for the preservation of the truth. What the moment cost him was not financial ruin. He was successful enough by 1959 that several $1,000s, while not trivial, was not devastating. What it cost him was something subtler: time, attention, the willingness to redirect himself from the considerable demands of a major film production to the private crisis of a woman he had never met. In the economy of a working life, that kind of redirection is not nothing. It requires a particular orientation of values, one in which the abstraction of human dignity carries enough weight to compete with the concrete pressures of schedule and obligation. He had grown up with a certain idea of what a man was supposed to be. Not the cinematic version, not the mythology he would eventually come to embody on screen, but something quieter and more domestic. A man who noticed what needed doing and did it without requiring an audience or a narrative arc. His own early life had not been without financial strain. He knew, at some cellular level, what it felt like to have the material circumstances of your life threaten the interior things, the dignity, the stability, the sense that the ground beneath you was solid. He did not speak about May Hopper's situation in those terms, at least not publicly, but the efficiency and completeness of his response suggests that he understood it in his bones. That private moment on the courthouse steps, 5 words, direct and plain and sufficient, is the still point of the whole story. The house is yours, ma'am. Not a speech, not a performance, not even really a gesture toward the cameras that were not there. Just the acknowledgement, offered from one human being to another, that the wrong thing had been turned around and the right thing had been restored. May Hopper had come to the courthouse expecting to watch the last chapter of her life be auctioned to strangers. She went home instead, to the kitchen Calvin had built, to the pecan trees that were bearing again, to the front bedroom where her daughter had been born, to a life that was still, improbably and completely, hers. That is the weight of what he did. Not the dollars, not the fame. The fact that he turned around what should not have happened to begin with, and that he did it quietly on a Tuesday and went back to work. There is something in this story that reaches past the particulars of 1959 and Bracketville and John Wayne's particular biography. Something that speaks to a question most of us carry without articulating it clearly. What do we owe each other when the systems fail? When the paperwork is correct and the law is satisfied but the outcome is still, plainly and visibly wrong, what then? Wayne's answer was uncomplicated. He did not litigate the question, or debate the ethics, or wait for someone more suited to intervene. He was there. He had the means, and so he acted. There is a kind of moral clarity in that simplicity that feels almost foreign in an age when most ethical questions come packaged with qualifications and counter-arguments and the fog of competing considerations. He saw the thing. He fixed the thing. He went back to work. We remember stories like this one, not because they are common, they are not, but because they remind us of something we want to believe is still possible. That the scale of a single person's quiet decency can be large enough to change the outcome for someone standing alone on a courthouse steps with nowhere left to turn. That heroism does not always announce itself. That sometimes it arrives in a work truck and asks a few quiet questions and pays what is owed. May Hopper lived 11 more years in the house that was hers. John Wayne finished his film. The pecan trees kept growing. Here is the question I want to leave with you. If you had been standing on those courthouse steps that morning, with the means, with the knowledge, with the proximity, would you have done the same? Think about that before you answer. And when you have your answer, leave it in the comments below, because that conversation is worth having. Some people pass through history loudly, and some of them, on a Tuesday morning when no one was watching, simply do the right thing. And that is the kind of story that outlasts all the rest.